The sound of shattering crystal was an explosion in the cathedral-like silence of the private dining room. For a heart-stopping second, no one moved. Then, a hand, thick with gold rings, shot out and seized Chloe's wrist. The grip was a vice, cold and unforgiving. "You'll pay for that with more than your paycheck, sweetheart," the man, a brutish lieutenant with a face like chiseled granite, hissed, his breath smelling of expensive whiskey and contempt. Humiliation, hot and sharp, flooded Chloe's cheeks. Every eye in the room was on her, a jury of predators waiting for the verdict from the one man who hadn't moved, the one man whose silence held more power than any shout. At the head of the long, polished table, Dante Moretti's gaze remained impassive, his stillness an unnerving counterpoint to the sudden violence. But what happened in that suffocating silence would change everything. And if you watch until the end, you will understand why his next words would shatter her world more than any crystal. Subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. This is a story about the moment a single glance becomes a life sentence, and you won't want to miss how it unfolds. The truth behind his protection is more dangerous than any threat, a debt that can only be paid with the soul. Chloe was 23, an art history student whose hands, usually so steady when holding a charcoal pencil, now trembled under the weight of a silver tray. She worked these private events to survive the biting New York winter and the mountain of debt her mother's illness had left behind. She was a ghost in these gilded cages, trained to be invisible, to anticipate needs without being noticed. Her life was a study in quiet resilience, a series of muted colors and hushed rooms, where her own voice was the one sound she rarely heard. She moved with a practiced grace, born not of confidence, but of a desperate need to avoid making a single mistake in a world where a broken glass could cost her a week's rent. The room itself was a velvet prison. Heavy drapes swallowed the city's distant sirens, creating a pocket of unnerving quiet. The air was thick with the scent of aged leather, rare cigars, and the metallic tang of power. Light from the crystal chandelier above cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe on the marble floor, a visual echo of the unspoken tensions coiled around the table. For Chloe, the clinking of silverware against porcelain was the ticking of a clock, counting down the minutes until she could escape back to her tiny, cold apartment, a sanctuary where she could breathe air that wasn't heavy with the arrogance of men who owned the world and everyone in it. Beneath her starched uniform, Chloe was an observer, an artist who saw the world in lines and shades of gray. In her worn satchel, tucked away like a secret, was a sketchbook filled with the faces of the city, the tired woman on the subway, the laughing child in the park, the lonely old man on the bench. It was her one act of defiance, this silent cataloging of humanity in a place that sought to strip her own. She saw the desperation behind the bravado of the men she served, the fear in their shifting eyes, the brittle foundation upon which their empires were built. Her art was her armor, the one place where her strong moral compass could make sense of the world's injustices. This sense of justice was a legacy, a painful inheritance from her father, a master carpenter who believed in the integrity of his craft. He had been ruined by a handshake deal with a man in a tailored suit, a man who smiled while signing a contract that was little more than a death warrant for his small business. The memory of her father's broken spirit was a constant, dull ache in Chloe's heart, a silent vow she had made to never be so easily deceived, to never surrender her dignity for the illusion of security. It was this memory that fueled her quiet endurance, her refusal to be cowed by the casual cruelty of wealth and power. Tonight, however, her armor felt thin. The tension in the room had been palpable from the moment she entered, a low hum of danger beneath the veneer of civilized conversation. She had performed her duties with meticulous care, her movements precise and economical, a silent dance to avoid drawing any attention. She refilled water glasses, cleared plates, and answered murmurs with a soft "of course, sir." She had learned to shrink herself, to become a functional part of the background, a pair of hands without a face, a presence without a person. It was a survival tactic, but with each passing hour, she felt another small piece of herself eroding away into the opulent silence. Before the glass slipped, before the lieutenant's hand closed around her wrist, she had noticed him. Dante Moretti. His stillness was not passive. It was a living thing, a force that bent the room around him. While his men postured and laughed too loudly, he simply watched, his dark eyes missing nothing. For a fleeting instant, as she poured his wine, their gazes had met. It wasn't the dismissive or predatory look she was accustomed to. It was something else entirely, an intense analytical scrutiny that seemed to peel back the layers of her uniform and see the frightened, defiant girl hiding beneath. That single, unnerving glance was the first tremor, the silent warning of the earthquake that was about to shatter her life. Her days began before the city, in the gray pre-dawn light that filtered through the single, grimy window of her walk-up apartment. The radiator's hiss was a poor substitute for warmth, and the thin blanket offered little comfort against the chill that seemed to seep from the very walls. Chloe's routine was a silent ritual of survival. She'd slip into the stiff black and white uniform that felt less like clothing and more like an erasure of self. It was a costume for a part she never auditioned for. The quiet, efficient girl who existed only in the periphery of other people's lavish lives. Every morning as she pinned her hair back, she would meet her own tired eyes in the mirror, a stranger looking back, her dreams of art and history filed away with her charcoal pencils. The subway ride downtown was a daily immersion in the city's crushing anonymity. Pressed between strangers, the air thick with the scent of damp wool and exhaustion, she would lose herself in the faces around her. She didn't see a crowd, she saw a gallery of untold stories. The deep lines on an old man's forehead, the anxious tap of a young woman's finger on her phone, the hollow look in a construction worker's eyes. These were the subjects she longed to capture on paper, the raw, unfiltered humanity that her own life was forced to suppress. The train would lurch and scream along the tracks, a mechanical monster swallowing her whole, only to spit her out into the cold, indifferent canyons of Manhattan, another invisible soul in a city of millions. Her primary job was at a high-end bistro, where the manager, a man named Henderson, wielded his minor authority like a weapon. He specialized in small cruelties, a backhanded compliment on her efficiency that was really a jab at her speed, a pointed look at a single misplaced fork, the way he would call her sweetheart with a sneer that curdled the word. Chloe absorbed these daily humiliations with a practiced stillness, her face a mask of polite neutrality. She needed the job too desperately to fight back. Each shift was an 8-hour exercise in self-control, in biting her tongue until it bled, in perfecting the art of being present but entirely unseen. It was a slow, grinding erosion of her spirit for a paycheck that barely covered her rent. The true source of the pressure, however, lay in a stack of envelopes on her small kitchen table. Medical bills, each one a stark white reminder of her mother's failing health and the inadequacy of her insurance. The numbers were astronomical, a mountain of debt that grew with every passing week. This financial vice was the reason she took on the extra catering gigs, the private events in penthouses and exclusive clubs, where the tips were better but the cost to her dignity was infinitely higher. She was running a race she could never win. Each dollar earned a single drop of water against a raging fire, the fear of failure a constant cold knot in the pit of her stomach. She spoke to her mother every evening, the phone call a fragile bridge across the miles to the quiet nursing home upstate. Chloe's voice would transform, becoming bright and reassuring. She would talk about her art history classes, embellishing small successes, never once mentioning the bone-deep exhaustion, the abusive managers, or the eviction notice taped to her door. She painted a picture of a life that was manageable, even hopeful, because her mother's peace of mind was the one thing she felt she could still protect. These conversations were her most draining performance, a loving deception that left her feeling more isolated than ever, alone with a truth too heavy to share. In her darkest moments, the ghost of her father would visit her. He had been a man who built things with his hands, a master carpenter who believed in the sanctity of a promise. She remembered the light in his eyes dimming after a wealthy developer had ruined him with a handshake and a web of legal loopholes. He had lost everything: his business, his pride, his will to fight. Chloe saw the same predatory smiles on the faces of the men she now served. This inherited memory was both a wound and a shield. It fueled her quiet defiance and her deep-seated conviction that true strength wasn't in power or wealth, but in the refusal to let the world break your moral core, even when it's breaking everything else. That evening, as she prepared for the private catering event at the Moretti penthouse, the uniform felt particularly suffocating. It was a higher-end version of her bistro attire, the fabric finer, but the message the same: you do not belong here. In the staff changing room, surrounded by the nervous chatter of other temporary workers, she felt a profound sense of dislocation. This world of marble floors, hushed tones, and casual cruelty was a universe away from her own. She smoothed down the crisp apron, her hands steady despite the tremor in her soul. She was an actress about to walk on stage, her role to be a flawless, silent cog in a machine of opulence she despised. The elevator ascended in a smooth, silent glide, a journey into the sky that felt more like a descent. Stepping out into the penthouse foyer was like entering another dimension. The air was different, perfumed with the scent of expensive cologne and rare flowers. Art that she had only ever seen in textbooks hung on the walls, their beauty a stark, almost violent contrast to the ugliness she knew was being discussed within these rooms. The city lights glittered below like a carpet of scattered diamonds, a breathtaking view that only made her feel smaller, more insignificant. She was a trespasser in a kingdom built on foundations she couldn't begin to comprehend. Before they were allowed to enter the dining room, the catering captain, a severe woman with a face like stone, gathered them for a final briefing. "These men are not your friends," she hissed, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "You do not make eye contact unless spoken to. You do not speak unless you are answering a direct question. A dropped fork is a disaster. A spilled drink is a catastrophe. You are invisible. You are silent. You are perfect. Do you understand?" The words hung in the air, a threat and a command. The pressure in the room was already immense, a tangible force pressing down on Chloe, making it hard to breathe. With the silver tray laden with delicate, impossibly expensive crystal flutes balanced on one hand, Chloe pushed open the heavy oak door to the private dining room. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. A low hum of conversation ceased, and a dozen pairs of eyes, sharp and predatory, turned toward her. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the metallic scent of power. At the head of the table sat a man whose stillness commanded the room, his dark eyes missing nothing. She felt his gaze land on her, not with the casual dismissal of the others, but with a sudden, intense focus that seemed to see right through her. In that instant, her hands began to tremble. The silence shattered first, then the crystal. A gasp, sharp and collective, was sucked from the air as the flute tumbled from Chloe's tray, a slow-motion tragedy of cascading champagne and splintering glass. The sound was a gunshot in the reverent quiet. Before she could even form an apology, the hand, brutal and heavy, clamped around her wrist. The lieutenant, a man whose face was a roadmap of petty cruelties, leaned in, his voice a low, venomous hiss. "You clumsy little thing! Do you have any idea what that cost?" The burn of humiliation was instant and overwhelming, a hot tide rising from her chest to her cheeks. She was no longer a person, just a mistake, a spectacle for a jury of powerful men. His grip tightened, the bones in her wrist grinding together. and she flinched, a small, involuntary movement of pain. Every eye at the table was on her, cold and appraising. They were predators who had scented weakness, their faces a mixture of contempt and mild amusement. She kept her gaze fixed on the marble floor, on the glittering shards of her failure, unable to meet the silent judgment of the room. The lieutenant's words were meant for one man's ears, a performance of dominance for the king at the head of the table. Chloe felt herself shrinking, a ghost in a uniform about to be exorcised by a casual display of force. Her world had narrowed to the crushing pressure on her arm and the sound of her own frantic heartbeat. Then a voice cut through the tension. It was not loud, but it had the weight of granite, a calm, cold authority that instantly silenced the lieutenant's threats. Let her go. The words were a command, not a request. Dante Moretti had not moved a muscle. He remained seated, his hands resting on the polished mahogany, his posture a study in controlled power. His suit was the color of a moonless night, tailored to perfection, a stark contrast to the barely concealed violence of his men. He did not need to raise his voice. His quietest whisper could shake the foundations of the city. The room held its breath, waiting for the ripple effect of his command, knowing that his word was law, absolute and unbreakable. The lieutenant's hand dropped from her wrist as if it had been burned. He recoiled, a flicker of fear replacing the arrogance in his eyes. He mumbled an apology, not to her, but to the man he had clearly disappointed. Chloe rubbed the tender skin of her wrist, the red imprint of the man's fingers a stark brand against her pale skin. She risked a glance upward, her eyes inexorably to the source of that power. Dante Moretti's gaze was not on his chastised subordinate or the mess on the floor. It was fixed on her. And in the depths of his dark, unreadable eyes, she saw something that terrified her more than any physical threat, a flicker of profound, unnerving recognition, as if he were looking past her uniform and into a part of her soul she kept hidden from the world. It was an examination, intense and deeply personal, that lasted only a few seconds but felt like an eternity. He saw not just her fear, but the defiance simmering beneath it. He saw the tremble in her hands, but also the strength in her spine that kept her from collapsing. It was as if he recognized a familiar ghost in her, a quiet integrity his world had long ago corrupted and destroyed in others. For a man who commanded legions and trafficked in secrets, her simple, unadorned honesty was a foreign language he suddenly, inexplicably understood. Chloe felt stripped bare under that gaze, a fragile piece of art being appraised by a collector who understood its true hidden value and its profound vulnerability. A subtle, almost imperceptible nod from Dante was all it took. One of the silent, dark-suited men standing sentinel by the door moved with fluid efficiency, stepping forward to address the catering captain who hovered nervously in the doorway. A few hushed words were exchanged, and the captain's face paled. Dante's attention, however, never left Chloe. He had dismissed the entire incident, the broken crystal, the insubordinate lieutenant, as if it were all a minor distraction from the real event unfolding in the room, his discovery of her. The sheer, effortless control he wielded was breathtaking, a silent symphony of power where a single glance could rewrite the rules and redirect fates. He didn't just own the room, he owned the very air within it. Then he spoke to her again, his voice still low and even, yet it carried across the silent room, meant for her ears alone. Your shift is over. The statement hung in the air, a verdict delivered by an unquestionable judge. It was not a kindness, nor was it a dismissal. It was a declaration. It meant she was no longer part of the scenery, no longer one of the invisible staff. She had been seen, singled out, and her life in that single moment had been irrevocably altered. She wanted to protest, to say she needed the money, to simply finish her job and disappear back into her anonymous life, but the words died in her throat. One did not argue with Dante Moretti. As she stood frozen, unable to process the shift in her reality, he delivered the final, devastating blow to her carefully constructed world. From this moment on, you're under my protection. The word protection sounded less like a shield and more like a cage. It was a claim, a mark of ownership spoken with the same dispassionate authority he might use to acquire a new company or sentence a rival. A cold dread, far deeper than the earlier humiliation, washed over her. Protection from what? From his own men or from the world itself? She understood instinctively that this was not a gift, it was a debt, and the terms of repayment were terrifyingly unclear. Without another word, Dante Moretti rose from his chair. The movement was fluid, elegant, and final. He adjusted his cuffs, his gaze sweeping over the room one last time before he turned and walked toward the exit, his security detail following into formation around him like shadows. He did not look at Chloe again, but he didn't need to. His presence lingered, a palpable energy that clung to the air, the scent of his expensive cologne a ghost in the room. He had entered her life like a storm, calm and silent at its center, and left behind a devastating quiet in his wake. The other men at the table began to murmur, their bravado returning slowly, but the dynamic had shifted forever. Chloe was eventually escorted out by the pale-faced catering captain, who refused to meet her eyes. She was paid for the full night, the cash pressed into her hand with a finality that felt like a severance. As she rode the elevator down, the scent of champagne and fear still clinging to her uniform, she could still feel the weight of Dante Moretti's gaze. It was a brand on her soul, a silent promise of a future she had never asked for. He had saved her from a moment of humiliation, only to pull her into a lifetime of danger. The crystal was broken, but it was her life that now lay in 1,000 glittering, treacherous pieces on the floor. Chloe tried to stitch the frayed edges of her old life back together, but the threads refused to hold. His words, "under my protection," were an invisible brand, a phantom weight on her shoulders. Her small apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a gilded cave with invisible bars. Every creak of the floorboards in the hallway, every siren wailing in the distance sent a jolt of anxiety through her. She was no longer just a struggling student. She was an object of interest to a man who moved in a world of shadows. The anonymity she had once found so crushing in the city was gone, replaced by the terrifying certainty that she was being watched, her every move catalogued by unseen eyes. She returned to her shifts at the bistro, the familiar clatter of plates and the drone of conversation, a poor anesthetic for her frayed nerves. Henderson's petty tyrannies, which once felt like major aggressions, now seemed laughably insignificant. Yet even here, Dante's presence lingered. One afternoon, a sleek black car, its windows tinted to an impossible darkness, was parked across the street for the entire duration of her lunch shift. It didn't move, it didn't signal, it simply existed, a silent obsidian sentinel. She felt its gaze on her back as she cleared tables, her hands trembling so badly she nearly dropped a tray of glasses, the memory of shattered crystal a fresh wound. The fear was a constant, low-grade fever, but beneath it, something else was taking root, a dangerous, unwelcome curiosity. She found herself searching for his face in the crowds, her artist's eyes scanning the sea of strangers for that specific stillness, that unnerving calm. He was a puzzle she couldn't stop trying to solve. Why her? A clumsy waitress who had made a simple mistake. It made no sense. This fascination was a betrayal of her own moral code, an attraction to the very power that had destroyed her father. She hated herself for it, for the small, treacherous part of her that felt a flicker of something other than terror when she thought of his dark, unreadable eyes. A week later, the coincidence became an intervention. She was leaving the bistro late, the alley behind the restaurant slick with rain and smelling of garbage. Henderson cornered her, his earlier grievances finally boiling over into a slurry of insults and a hand that gripped her arm too tightly. Chloe froze, the familiar feeling of powerlessness washing over her. Just as she opened her mouth to protest, a car engine, impossibly quiet, purred to life at the end of the alley. Headlights cut through the gloom, pinning them in a harsh white glare. The The black sedan was there again, its presence more absolute than a spoken threat. Henderson's hand fell away as if he'd been electrocuted. He didn't get out of the car. The tinted window didn't even slide down. There was no need. The message was delivered with chilling efficiency. Henderson stammered an apology and practically fled back into the restaurant. The car remained for a long moment, its engine a low, steady hum, before it pulled silently away from the curb and disappeared into the rain-swept streets. Chloe was left standing alone in the alley, her heart hammering against her ribs, drenched in a mixture of rain and cold sweat. He had protected her again, but the act felt less like chivalry and more like a display of absolute, terrifying control over her world. She began to see him everywhere, or perhaps she was only now noticing the threads of his influence woven into the fabric of the city. His family name was etched onto the brass plaques of museums and hospital wings, a veneer of respectable philanthropy over a foundation of whispered violence. One evening, seeking refuge in the hushed halls of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, she saw him. He was standing across the gallery, observing a Caravaggio painting of David with the head of Goliath. He was alone, his expression unguarded for a fleeting moment, revealing a profound melancholy that seemed to echo the darkness in the painting. He looked less like a monster and more like a man haunted by his own victories. Their eyes met across the cavernous room. The tourists and the security guards melted away, leaving only the two of them suspended in a silent, charged space. He didn't smile or nod. He simply held her gaze, a silent acknowledgement of the unbreakable thread that now connected them. In that look, she saw not just the cold commander from the penthouse, but a flicker of something else, a deep-seated weariness, a loneliness that mirrored her own. It was a terrifying moment of connection, a glimpse of the man behind the myth, and it destabilized her more than any threat. She turned and fled, the sound of her own footsteps echoing on the marble floor. Back in her apartment, she couldn't escape his image. She took out her sketchbook, her charcoal pencil moving with a frantic energy she didn't know she possessed. She drew his face from memory, trying to capture the contradiction she had seen. The hard line of his jaw, the controlled set of his mouth, the immense sadness in his eyes. It was an act of exorcism, an attempt to understand him, to pin him down on paper and regain some semblance of control. But the more she drew, the more human he became, and the more her fear began to tangle with a dangerous, unwanted empathy. She was drawing the predator, but she was finding the man. Meanwhile, in an office of glass and steel high above the glittering city, Dante Moretti watched the rain trace paths down the window. On his polished desk lay a single, discreetly obtained file. It contained everything about her: her financial struggles, her mother's illness, her quiet, unremarkable life of dignity and desperation. He had ordered the surveillance to ensure her safety, to honor the strange protective impulse that had seized him in that dining room. But it had become something else entirely. Reading about her quiet courage, her selfless sacrifices, felt like a violation, a trespass into a sacred space. He was tainting her with his world just by observing it. This girl, with her artist's hands and her unwavering moral compass, had become an obsession. She was a relic from a life he might have lived, a ghost of the man he might have been before his father's legacy had claimed him. Her innocence was not a weakness. It was a form of strength he had never encountered, a light so pure that it cast a harsh glare on the darkness of his own soul. He found himself rearranging his schedule for the chance to catch a glimpse of her, a silent, distant observer, drawn to a flame he knew he would ultimately extinguish if he got too close. This irrational pull was a liability, a crack in the armor he had spent a lifetime forging. He tried to sever the connection, to relegate her to a simple problem that could be managed with money and manpower. He instructed one of his men to anonymously pay off her mother's medical debt in full. It was a clean, simple solution, a way to ease his conscience and cut the cord. But the report came back the next day. The hospital administration had received the funds, but Chloe had appeared that morning, demanding to know the source. She had refused the payment, stating with a quiet, unshakable firmness that she did not accept charity from strangers. She would pay her own debts. Her integrity was not for sale. That act of defiance struck him with the force of a physical blow. In his world, everyone had a price. Loyalty, honor, life itself. It was all currency. But she was different. She operated by a code he had long forgotten, a set of principles that made her both maddeningly stubborn and breathtakingly beautiful. Her refusal was not an insult, it was a challenge. It told him that his power, the very force that bent the city to his will, was useless against her. He couldn't buy her, he couldn't intimidate her, and the realization left him feeling both powerless and profoundly intrigued. He was a king who had just discovered a corner of his kingdom he could not conquer. The tension between them simmered, an unspoken conversation carried on through stolen glances and near-miss encounters. He would see her on the street, her worn coat pulled tight against the wind, and the urge to step out of his car to shield her from the cold was a physical ache in his chest. She would feel his presence before she saw him, a sudden shift in the atmosphere, a prickling on the back of her neck that told her she was no longer alone. They were two celestial bodies caught in a dangerous orbit, circling each other, the gravitational pull growing stronger with each rotation, threatening to pull them into a devastating collision. One night, the unspoken threat that shadowed her steps took a physical form. She was walking the few blocks from the subway to her apartment, the streetlights casting long, distorted shadows on the wet pavement. A car, not Dante's, but a beat-up sedan, had been following her for several blocks. It slowed as she did, its engine rumbling menacingly in the quiet street. Her heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She quickened her pace, clutching her keys in her fist like a weapon, the metallic edges digging into her palm. The memory of the lieutenant's sneering face flashed in her mind. This was a consequence, a ripple from the stone he had thrown into her life. The sedan swerved to the curb, cutting off her path. Two men got out, their silhouettes large and menacing under the flickering orange glow of a streetlight. They didn't speak, they just started walking toward her, their intentions radiating a palpable aura of violence. Chloe backed away, her breath catching in her throat. There was nowhere to run. The street was deserted, a lonely canyon of brick and asphalt. This was it, the moment the invisible danger of his world became brutally, terrifyingly real. She was a pawn in a game she didn't understand, and she was about to be sacrificed. Just as the men closed in, a pair of headlights sliced through the darkness from the opposite end of the street. The familiar, silent purr of a high-performance engine filled the air. Dante's car slid to a halt beside her, a phantom of polished black steel. The passenger door swung open with an almost silent click. He leaned across the seat, his face half hidden in shadow, but his eyes were blazing with a cold, controlled fury she had never seen before. His voice was low, urgent, and absolute, a command that cut through her terror and left no room for hesitation. "Chloe, get in the car, now." It was not a question or an offer of help. It was a verdict. Her world had just been reduced to a single, impossible choice. Outside the car was a certain, brutal violence. Inside the car was Dante Moretti, a man who represented a different, more insidious kind of danger, a danger to her soul. Stepping into that vehicle was a surrender, an acknowledgement that her life was no longer her own. But as the shadows of the men loomed closer, she knew there was no choice at all. She was caught between two darknesses, and she reached for the one that had, for some inexplicable reason, chosen to protect her. She moved without thinking, a primal instinct for survival overriding the paralysis of fear. Her hand reached for the cold chrome handle, her body lunging into the opulent darkness of the car's interior. The scent of expensive leather and Dante's subtle, clean cologne enveloped her, a stark contrast to the grimy, rain-soaked street. The heavy door slammed shut behind her, the sound a definitive, echoing finality, like a vault being sealed. It cut off the outside world, trapping her in a new, more intimate kind of danger. Through the tinted window, she saw the two men halt, their expressions shifting from predatory confidence to confusion, their forms distorted by the glass, becoming monstrous caricatures in a nightmare she could not escape. For a heart-stopping moment, they hesitated, caught in the silent challenge of the obsidian vehicle. Then, arrogance won over caution. One of them smirked, taking a step forward and rapping his knuckles hard against the driver's side window, a foolish act of bravado. The sound was a dull, profane thud in the insulated quiet of the cabin. Chloe flinched, pressing herself against the plush seat, her breath a knot of ice in her chest. She was a spectator to her own fate, watching through a dark lens as the ugliness of the world she had stumbled into prepared to shatter the fragile barrier between her and them. She expected a window to slide down, a cold word of warning to be issued. She was wrong. Instead, Dante's door opened with a soft hydraulic hiss. He didn't rush. He emerged with a fluid, deliberate grace that was far more terrifying than any sudden movement. He was a shadow, detaching itself from the greater darkness, his tailored suit unrumpled, his posture radiating an absolute, chilling calm. The two thugs took an involuntary step back, the sheer force of his presence hitting them like a physical blow. This was not a man who delegated his problems. This was a man who had become a problem for them. In that instant, Dante Moretti broke his own cardinal rule. He stepped out of the shadows and into the gutter, not as a boss, but as a combatant. His world was one of whispers and distance, yet here he was, on a wet street, for her. The violence was shockingly brief, an exercise in brutal efficiency. It was not a fight, it was a dismantling. Chloe watched horrified as Dante moved with the predator's economy of motion. There was the sickening crack of bone as he disabled the first man's arm, followed by a low, guttural sound as the second man was driven backward into the brick wall, slumping to the ground in a heap. It was over in less than 10 seconds. No wasted energy, no theatricality. Just a swift, merciless application of force that spoke of a lifetime of familiarity with violence. She was seeing the truth of him now, not the refined businessman from the penthouse, but the foundation of fear upon which his empire was built. The monster was real. He stood for a moment in the rain, the weak streetlight glinting off his dark hair. His chest rose and fell in a steady, controlled rhythm, betraying none of the violence he had just unleashed. He looked down at the two groaning figures on the pavement with an expression of pure, cold contempt, as if they were nothing more than an inconvenience he had been forced to address personally. Then he straightened his tie, a small, precise gesture of restoring order to a world he had just violently disrupted. This simple act was more chilling than the fight itself. It was the seamless transition from brutal predator back to untouchable Ting, and it underscored the terrifying chasm between his world and hers. When he slid back into the driver's seat, the atmosphere inside the car became suffocating. The violence was over, but its ghost sat between them, a cold, silent passenger. The scent of rain and the faint, metallic tang of blood now clung to him, an invisible stain on the pristine interior. He didn't start the engine. He just sat there, his hands resting on the steering wheel, his knuckles slightly scraped. Chloe couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. She had been saved by the very thing she should fear the most. He had protected her, but in doing so, he had shown her the terrifying, bloody price of that protection. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the debt she now owed was immeasurable. Finally, he turned his head. and his eyes found hers in the dim light. The pulled fury was gone, replaced by something far more complex and unsettling, a raw, unguarded vulnerability. She saw the ghost of the man from the museum, the one haunted by his own darkness. He raised a hand and she flinched, a small, involuntary reaction. He paused, his fingers hovering in the space between them, before he continued, his touch impossibly gentle as he brushed a damp strand of hair from her cheek. It was not a lover's caress or an act of dominance. It was a gesture of profound, aching regret, a silent apology for the world he had dragged her into, a world where such horrors were necessary. That gentle touch broke the spell of her fear, and in its place a fragile, desperate courage bloomed. Her voice, when it came, was a mere whisper, but it was steady, laced with the steel of her unbroken spirit. "What do you want from me?" It was not the question of a victim. It was the demand of an equal, a soul refusing to be a possession. She was breaking her own rule of silent survival, rejecting the role of the damsel he had assigned her. She was looking the monster in the eye and asking for its name, for its purpose, refusing to be a pawn in a game she was never meant to play. The question hung in the air, a challenge that demanded more than a simple answer. It demanded the truth. Dante's gaze held hers, and for a moment she saw his carefully constructed facade crumble. The mask of the untouchable crime boss fell away, revealing the man beneath, a man burdened by a legacy he never chose. His voice was low, rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "I saw a glimpse of a world I lost," he said, the confession costing him more than any business deal or violent confrontation. He looked away, out at the rain-streaked city. "I see now that all I've done is drag it into the dark with me." It was an admission of failure, a devastating acknowledgement that his protection was in itself a form of destruction. He started the car, the engine a low, mournful purr that filled the sudden, immense silence. He had answered her question, and in doing so, he had laid his own soul bare. He was not a savior. He was a collector of beautiful things he ultimately broke. She was not a project. She was his penance. The car pulled away from the curb, leaving the two men and the violence behind in the rain. But they were not escaping. They were trapped together in the aftermath, suspended in a bubble of shared, terrible knowledge. Everything had changed. The line had not just been crossed, it had been erased. And neither of them knew how to find their way back. He drove her back in a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence in the car. The rain lashed against the windows, blurring the city lights into abstract streaks of color, a perfect reflection of her fractured state of mind. He did not pull up to her building, but stopped a block away, a new, deliberate distance already being drawn between them. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then he turned to her, his face a mask of stone in the dashboard's faint glow. "Go," he said, and the single word was filled with the weight of 1,000 goodbyes he could never say. She opened the door and stepped back into the rain, not looking back as the obsidian car melted into the night, leaving behind a void that was colder than the winter air. Back inside her apartment, the familiar space felt alien and unsafe. The lock on the door was a flimsy piece of metal against a world that now held tangible monsters. She shed her damp coat, her movements slow and robotic, her body still humming with the aftershock of adrenaline and fear. She stood in the center of the small room, the silence pressing in on her, a stark contrast to the violent symphony of the alley. Her fingers rose to her cheek, where his hand had rested, the ghost of his touch a searing brand on her skin. The memory was a paradox she could not reconcile. The same hand that had just broken a man had offered her a moment of impossible, aching tenderness. She was haunted not by the monster, but by the man who held it on a leash. Miles away, in a penthouse that touched the clouds, Dante Moretti stood before a wall of glass, the city sprawling beneath him like a conquered kingdom. He looked at his own reflection, a dark silhouette against a tapestry of lights, and saw not a king but a desecrator. On his hand, the skin over his knuckles was scraped raw, a vulgar physical reminder of the crude violence he had brought into her orbit. He had broken his most sacred rule: never get his own hands dirty, never expose the machinery of his power. He had done it for her, to shield her from the ugliness, but in doing so, he had become the ugliest thing in her world. The protection he offered was a poison, and he had just forced her to drink it. The consequences began before the sun rose. A call from his most trusted captain confirmed his fears. The men in the alley were not random predators. They were soldiers from a rival family, a deliberate probe sent to test his defenses and gauge his response. His uncharacteristic public interest in a civilian waitress had been noticed. It was a signal of a potential weakness, a crack in the impenetrable fortress of his reputation. Chloe was no longer just a woman. She was a liability, a piece on a chessboard she didn't even know she was playing on. Any further contact would not be a shield for her, but a target painted on her back, an invitation for his enemies to strike at the one thing he had foolishly shown he cared about. The days that followed were defined by an uneasy stillness. The black sedan no longer shadowed her movements. At the bistro, Henderson treated her with a terrified deference that was more isolating than his previous cruelty. The other staff gave her a wide berth, whispering behind their hands, sensing she was marked by a power they could not comprehend. She was safe, but she had never felt more alone. Dante's protection had become a quarantine, a glass wall that separated her from the mundane frustrations of her old life, leaving her suspended in a silent, empty space. The absence of his presence was a constant, heavy ache, a silence that screamed louder than any threat. Her fear began to calcify, transforming into a hard, painful clarity. She understood now. His protection was never about her safety in the conventional sense. It was about preserving an idea, an image of purity he saw in her that he believed his world had destroyed in himself. She was a living relic of a moral code he admired but could no longer practice. By saving her from the brutishness of his lieutenant, he had set in motion a chain of events that culminated in him revealing his own. He had retreated not just to protect her from his enemies, but to protect her from himself. This realization was a deeper wound than any physical threat, a profound sorrow for the man trapped inside the monster. Dante, in turn, retreated into the cold calculus of his empire. He moved with a renewed, calculated ruthlessness, making an example of the rival family who had dared to touch his interests. The retribution was swift, silent, and devastating, a move that sent a clear and chilling message through the underworld. It was an act of war fought in her name, a bloody, invisible fortress he was building around her. Each brutal decision, each cold command was a brick in the wall that separated them, a necessary act of self-immolation to ensure the fire of his world would never again reach her. He was saving her by becoming the very thing she would have to hate, the very thing he hated in himself. Chloe found she could no longer sketch the faces of strangers. Their simple, everyday worries seemed a world away from the complex darkness she now understood. She took out her sketchbook and, with a hand that was finally steady, she drew his face from memory. It was no longer the drawing of a predator, but a portrait of a king in a gilded cage. She captured the immense weight in his eyes, the subtle tension in his jaw, the profound solitude that clung to him like a shroud. Her art became an act of translation, a way to process the terrible, beautiful, and broken humanity she had been allowed to witness. It was an elegy for a connection that had lived and died in a single violent night. Some evenings, she would stand at her small window, looking out at the city that had once felt so vast and anonymous. Now it felt like a map of their separation. She knew he was up there, in one of the towers that pierced the sky, looking down on the same indifferent streets. He was a distant star, a point of cold, brilliant light, and she was a solitary figure on the ground below, forever in his orbit but impossibly far away. The rain would fall, washing the city clean, but it could not wash away the memory of his touch or the echo of his voice. They were two lonely souls sharing the same storm from opposite sides of a window pane, forever separated by the glass. The silence stretched from days into weeks. The eviction notice on her door was replaced by an anonymous letter stating her rent had been paid for the year. The hospital informed her that an anonymous benefactor had settled her mother's entire medical debt. These were his ghosts, his final acts of protection from a distance. Transactions that settled every debt but the one that truly mattered between them. The quiet was no longer an absence of his presence, but a confirmation of his permanent departure. The story had ended, the transgression had been paid for, and all that remained was the profound, aching echo of everything that had been left unsaid. A year passed, a quiet eternity measured not in days, but in the slow return of color to Chloe's world. The anonymous funds had been a lifeline she couldn't refuse without sacrificing her mother's well-being. A final, invisible chain to him that she chose to transform into a key. She left the bistro, enrolled in a full-time arts program, and poured every waking hour into her work. Tonight was the culmination, her first student showcase, held in a small brick-walled gallery in Chelsea. The air smelled of turpentine and wine, a heady perfume of possibility. Surrounded by her charcoal landscapes of the city's forgotten corners, she felt a fragile, unfamiliar sense of peace. She had taken the silent, blood-stained freedom he had given her and used it to build a small, quiet world of her own making, a world filled with light. She felt the shift in the room before she saw him, a sudden drop in atmospheric pressure, as if a storm had gathered just outside the door. Her heart gave a single, painful thud against her ribs. He stood near the entrance, a stark figure in a dark wool coat, his stillness a vortex in the gentle current of the crowd. He was a ghost from another life, a specter of power and pain who had no place in this sanctuary of creation. He did not look at her. His attention was solely on the art, his movements slow and deliberate as he walked the perimeter of the room, a silent observer appraising the pieces of her soul she had hung on the walls. Each step he took was a footstep on her heart, a quiet intrusion that was both terrifying and achingly familiar. He moved past her drawings of tired subway commuters and lonely park benches, his expression unreadable. Then he stopped. He stood before a piece set apart from the others, the one she had almost not included. It was a portrait, rendered in deep, unforgiving charcoal. It was his face. But she had not drawn the monster from the alley or the king from the penthouse. She had drawn the man from the museum, the one she saw reflected in the darkness of the Caravaggio. She had captured the profound loneliness in his eyes, the invisible weight of a crown he never asked for, the heartbreaking chasm between the man he was and the man he was forced to be. It was not an accusation, it was an absolution. Across the crowded gallery, their eyes finally met. He was still looking at the portrait, but his gaze lifted to find hers, and in that single, silent exchange, the entire story was told. She saw no power in his eyes, no threat, only a raw, unguarded astonishment. He was seeing himself for the first time, not through the lens of fear or loyalty, but through the compassionate gaze of the one person who had looked into the abyss and had not flinched. He was seeing the humanity she had salvaged for him. In that moment, he was not Dante Moretti, head of the city's most feared crime family. He was just a man, seen and understood, his soul laid bare on a sheet of paper. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a greeting or a farewell. It was a concession, a surrender, a thank you that resonated across the space between them with more power than any spoken word. Then he turned and was gone, melting back into the night as silently as he had appeared, leaving behind not a void, but a profound sense of completion. Chloe turned her gaze back to the portrait, a slow, deep breath filling her lungs. The debt was finally paid. Not with money or fear, but with the one currency his world could never comprehend: empathy. He had given her a life free from financial ruin. She had given him back a piece of his soul. His protection had been a cage of shadows, but her understanding had finally set them both free. This was their true ending, a story written in charcoal and silence, proving that even in the darkest corners, a single act of seeing can be its own form of redemption. If their journey moved you, show your support by liking and sharing this story, and tell us in the comments what you believe true forgiveness looks like. Your engagement helps us create more moments like this. Subscribe for more stories that find the light in the most unexpected of hearts. And never forget the power of a single, unflinching gaze.